The idea was to bring them away from the tower, which they had surrounded, so those trapped inside, who would certainly have been murdered, could escape. So Richard rode through London to try to draw the rebels away. Did it work? No. No, it did not. Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a podcast that makes history more accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff. Disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. So I know I do a lot of medieval stuff, but in all fairness, it's just so fascinating. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about a violent, yet fascinatingly political moment of the late 14th century world, the Peasants' Rebellion in England, 1381. England in the 14th century was in transition. By 1381, England was still recovering from the effects of the Black Death and some recurring waves of plague outbreaks. The feudal system was near its end, unable to function without a large peasant base, many of whom had died from disease. The government, as a result, was in shambles. Richard II had only just been crowned 4 years prior and was 9 when he became king. And out of this chaos, and because of some poorly thought out economic decisions, we see an uprising of the common folk who were tired of their government, tired of corruption, and tired of life in a failing feudal society. So they fought back. In today's episode, we'll go over this event, sometimes relegated to a single sentence in a history textbook, but as one of my all-time favorite authors and historians Dan Jones notes in his book, Summer of Blood, quote, "The revolt marked the beginnings of a rebellious tradition among the English lower orders, which has been repeated ever since. The year 1381 is a signpost on the road from the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and Magna Carta in 1215 to Bosworth in 1485 and the Armada in 1588, and everything beyond." End quote. As usual, I'll begin with some historical context. What was happening that led to the Peasants' Rebellion? And once we square away the years leading up to 1381, we'll talk about the rebellion itself and its major players. And I know it may not sound like a banger of a story, but trust me, it gets very juicy in all the best ways. So let's get started. So obviously, for an episode about a peasant's rebellion, we need to know what they were rebelling against. And for that, we turn to historical context. What was happening in England that left the common folk so fed up with how things were going that they rallied around a handful of organizers, stormed various cities, including Canterbury and London, burned some important places to the ground, executed powerful men. What in the world was happening in England? Well, let's go back to my favorite topic of all time, the Black Death. The Black Death swept through Europe between 1347 and 1353, though the peak years were 47 to 51. And in that period of time, an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population died. Nobody was safe. It spread to towns and cities so quickly that in some places, like Siena, Italy, over 2/3 of the population died in a matter of days or weeks, and there were few left to bury the dead. I did a whole episode on the Black Death. It was actually episode number 50 for me, which was a really nice milestone, so go check that out if you haven't already. And I also did an AF-Out mini episode, on YouTube at least, about Joan of England, who was daughter of King Edward III, who died of the plague during the peak years while en route to Castile to marry her betrothed. She was the first royal to die of plague. If you didn't already know, I put out mini episodes on YouTube where I do shorter topics, so you should go check them out. But anyway, the Black Death was massively detrimental to the feudal status quo in England, since roughly 1/3 of the population died, and many of them the peasants. So let's talk about how the feudal system in England worked, why the plague undermined it, and how that led to the Peasants' Rebellion. Now, certainly, plague wasn't the only thing that led to the decline of feudalism. In truth, some peasants had already started moving away from feudal lands to the cities, where they could engage in a bustling trade network with other cities across Europe that connected to the broader Silk Road's trade network. And in many cities, guilds were going strong, creating new generations of tradesmen. So it wasn't as if the Black Death was just a switch that turned off feudalism and turned on a new way of living, but I can't think of any historians who would disagree with the argument that the Black Death hastened that process and led to the transition away from feudal medieval Europe into the early modern period. That being said, here's a brief and simplified explanation of the feudal system. It was brought to England with William the Conqueror, a Norman invader who landed in 1066 and, well, conquered. You probably learned about feudalism in school with the pyramid. King at the top, nobles, knights, and peasants at the bottom. It's simplistic, but it gets the idea across, that feudalism was a system of management where the upper classes could control their lands and the people on them. Peasants, in many ways the subjects of today's episode, made up roughly 90% of medieval society, and though some were free, many were serfs, bound to the land and their lord without the freedom to do much else. And by the end of the 14th century, there were fewer serfs and more freed men, but again, this was a process that was hastened by the Black Death. As I mentioned, we typically estimate that approximately 1/3 of the population died of plague, and although nobody was safe, a majority of those who died were the peasants, living in cramped villages where the plague could easily spread from one person to another. It was absolute chaos and misery and despair. But to connect it to today's story, we need to look at the economic and political aspect of all of this peasant death. If 90% of England's population were laborers, either as serfs in the fields or free farmers or workers in the city, then who was going to keep the economy going? I mean, we certainly wouldn't expect to see, the Duke of Lancaster out tilling his own fields, right? The rapid devastation that came in the wake of the plague meant that something had to be done to try and salvage the economy and workforce. Because if a government doesn't have a functioning economy, then it's not a functioning government. And so King Edward III, still reeling from his own daughter's death from the plague, issued the 1349 Ordinance of Laborers. And here's an excerpt from that source, but I'm actually going to go with the version from Rosemary Horrocks' Black Death sourcebook. This is a classic, I use this all of the time, because it's much easier to follow along than the original text. The translation is really good in that one. Though I did include the more convoluted one in the sources in the description if you're interested. Quote, "Since a great part of the population, and especially workers and servants, has now died in this pestilence, many people, observing the needs of the masters and the shortage of servants, are refusing to work unless they are paid an excessive salary. Others prefer to beg in idleness rather than work for a living. Mindful of the serious inconvenience likely to arise from this shortage, especially of agricultural laborers, we have discussed and considered the matter with our nobles and other learned men. And we have ordained that every man or woman in our realm of England, whether free or unfree, who is physically fit and below the age of 60, not living by trade or exercising a particular craft, and not having private means of land of their own upon which they need to work, and not working for someone else, shall, if offered employment, must be obliged to accept the employment offered, and they should be paid only the amount which was usually paid in the part of the country in the year 1346. End quote. A simple summary of that, if the Middle English was a bit hard to get through: if you don't already have a job, and you can work, you have to work. The source later goes on to say that you can't leave your current job to find another one with better wages either, and that there would be punishments for not working, for being idle, etc., etc. There are a bunch of primary sources detailing legal cases against men accused of not working, so we know they tried to enforce this. And if you didn't catch it in the text that I quoted, the amount of money they would be making would be what it was pre-plague. When there were significantly more people around to do the same amount of work. So here's another way of thinking about it, and I'll use myself as an example. Maybe I was a serf, working in the barley fields. Before the plague, I had maybe 15 to 20 other people helping me till the fields and harvest and do all the agricultural chores. But now, let's just say 2/3 of the workers died of plague. With the king's ordinance, I'm essentially forced to stay at this job, working for the same employer, earning the same amount of money I earned before the plague, but now there are only 4 to 5 other people to help me. I'm doing more work for the same amount of pay. So if I were to tell you that people were super angry about the Ordinance of Laborers, you could probably understand why. I mean, think about that. The government is forcing you to work if you are able. You can't refuse them under threat of imprisonment. You can't change jobs. You will be paid a lower salary than you probably need to survive in the economy. And if you're already making the connection between this and the Peasants' Rebellion that happens a few decades later in 1381, you'd be right in making that connection. The 1349 Ordinance of Laborers was ratified as the Statute of Laborers in 1351, and it was met with a mixture of hostility, contempt, and point-blank refusal, to quote Dan Jones. It was a futile government effort to control every aspect of the economy and to support the nobility and other landowners in their mission to maintain power over their people, the last vestiges of the feudal order, right? But it also fueled a growing divide between landowners and workers. The divide was always there. But as is what typically happens with pandemics, those divides were made more obvious with economic uncertainty and political chaos. And as I used to teach to my students in AP World History, when you've got economic uncertainty and political chaos, rebellion is not far behind. There is only so much that the common people will put up with before they take a stand. And there are examples of that happening in virtually every human civilization in the history of our planet. And I'm going to quote Dan Jones again here because, honestly, he's just an incredible history writer, and I love how he ties things together. Quote, "For the workers, suddenly feeling the full weight of royal law, the legislation was a gross affront. It attacked not just the wages in their pocket, but their dreams of betterment. Society had loosened its strictures on social advancement during previous generations, and now all of that was under threat, and the specter of a new serfdom loomed over villages across the English countryside. It was not, perhaps, the old manorial system, but the laws seemed gradually to be reinstating the misery of bondage by any other name." End quote. There were more indignities, of course. A poll tax was passed right before King Edward III died in 1377, which demanded a flat 4 pence from everyone over the age of 14. It was a way to help pay for the ongoing expenses of the 100 Years' War, which began in 1337, and it also put the commoners in check. It didn't help that when Edward died, his 9-year-old grandson Richard II was crowned. Having a boy king and his regents run England did not inspire confidence when the political and economic system was already so unstable. And speaking of the 100 Years' War, things weren't going so well on that front either, and there was the legitimate threat of a French invasion weighing on people's minds. And the French did invade England in August 1377 when they landed on the Isle of Wight, looting, pillaging, killing, setting fires. Things were bad and getting worse. A second poll tax was levied, and peasants paid about the same amount, but it didn't raise enough money. So in 1380, Parliament was called together to find a way to raise the money to keep England going. And to do this, they decided to levy a higher tax, around 3 to 4 times more than the previous 2 poll taxes. Just imagine that for a second. Raising your taxes by up to 4 times the amount you're paying right now, all at once. It would be crippling, right? And it certainly was for the commoners of England. And it was the latest indignity of being a commoner in England, transitioning out of feudalism, and for some, it was time to revolt. And in southeast England, in Kent, 2 men named Wat Tyler and John Ball were gathering people together in protest of the restriction of their freedoms, the taxes, and the potential regression to serfdom and bondage. And soon enough, Wat Tyler and John Ball would march their angry peasant army to Canterbury, and then to London. The rebellion began in Kent, and it spread from town to town, rallying commoners who wanted to take up arms against those who would tax them unfairly. And from the beginning, the rebellion used violence to spark fear. As the rebels visited new towns, they brought with them, on pikes, the blackening, decaying heads of decapitated men. We're not talking about men arguing in the local tavern about unfair government practices, right? This was a proper rebellion. 14th century French chronicler Jean Froissart wrote that, quote, "There happened in England great commotions among the lower ranks of the people, by which England was near ruined without resource. Never was a country in such jeopardy as was this at that period. It is customary in England for the nobility to have great privileges over the commoners, whom they keep in bondage. In the counties of Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Bedford, these services are more oppressive than in all the rest of the kingdom. The evil disposed in these districts began to rise, saying they were too severely oppressed. A crazy priest in the county of Kent, called John Ball, was greatly instrumental in inflaming them with those ideas." End quote. I've mentioned Froissart in other episodes. He is an excellent source for 14th century France and England. He's biased in favor of the elite, sure, but he's still a great source of information. And in this summary of the Peasants' Revolt, he mentions John Ball as the instigator. Ball was a priest who had been arrested several times prior to 1381 for rabble-rousing, speaking out against political and social inequality and corruption within the Catholic Church. He was an advocate for the peasantry, and he spoke out against those who would take advantage of them. So you could imagine how he felt about the poll taxes. And in fact, in the beginning of the rebellion, he was actually still imprisoned. It was Wat Tyler who broke him out. Wat Tyler became the de facto leader of the rebellion because of his organizational and leadership skills. Dan Jones and others speculates that he had some military or combat experience because of how well he was able to raise and command men to fight for him. And between the two of them, a man of the cloth, inspiring people to rally against corruption and tyranny, and a leader who could properly organize and plan attacks, there was a team capable of fighting back. Many of John Ball's speeches and letters have been digitized. Here's an excerpt from one called "Cast Off the Yoke of Bondage," which he supposedly gave when the rebellion marched to London. "From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. For if God would have had any bondsman from the beginning, he would have appointed who would have had any bond and who free. And therefore I exhort you to consider that now the time is come, appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if ye will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty." End quote. Perhaps you can see why the establishment hated him so much. The men and their followers marched to Canterbury intent on taking it, and along with taking the city, they were looking for those who were responsible for things like the poll tax. So, tax collectors, sheriffs, treasurers, anyone in a position of authority over the commoners. But the most hated man of all was John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. John of Gaunt was the fourth born, but third surviving son of Edward III. He was uncle to the young king, Richard II, and he had tremendous power and control over his nephew. He was widely considered to be the most powerful man in England, and he also owned more lands throughout England than anyone else at the time. And in addition to raising money for the war against France, John of Gaunt also wanted to sail for Portugal to take lands there as well. So part of the reason England was so keen on raising money through the poll taxes was because of John of Gaunt's influence and actions. And as such, many of John of Gaunt's people were targeted by the rebellion. As Tyler and Ball's men flooded the city, traitors were brought into the streets and beheaded. And this violence went on for about a month. Canterbury streets were red with blood. And it didn't take long for London and the young king to hear about what was happening. And in a really interesting twist, the teenage Richard II agreed to come out to Blackheath on the outskirts of London, south of the River Thames, and meet with the rebels. And so Wat Tyler, John Ball, and the growing chorus of rioters marched towards London in June of 1381 to meet with the king. Tens of thousands of rebels arrived at Blackheath on June 12th, and they soon received word from a royal messenger that the king would meet them the following morning. But it is important to note that the group was not planning a regicide. They didn't want to kill the king. They wanted to, in Dan Jones's words, correct the iniquities of the kingdom and demonstrate before their young king the tyranny of his advisors. As some of the rebels were waiting, they went to the nearby manor of Lambeth, which is the London home attributed to whoever serves as the Archbishop of Canterbury, which in this period of time was Simon Sudbury. He was high on the target list, as many believed that Sudbury, alongside John of Gaunt, was principally responsible for the poll taxes and general tyranny over the peasants. So the rebels, on the night of June 12th, ransacked his London home, perhaps a foreshadowing of what was going to happen should they come across the man himself. June 13th was the festival of Corpus Christi. Yes, like the coastal city in Texas, and Tyler and Ball were preparing to meet the king. Sudbury was with the king, fearing what should happen if he was seen and captured right, and Sudbury's concerns had definitely transferred to the king, who was now wise enough to not land ashore and meet Tyler and his angry mob of tens of thousands of peasants who were all being egged on by John Ball's sermons about equality. So instead, Richard stayed on the water on his boat and agreed to hear their demands in a written petition. And what did they ask for? Death. They wanted the heads of all of the king's advisors, the ones they believed were ruining both king and country, and that list included men like John of Gaunt and Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury. The king's barge turned around on the river and headed right back towards the city, toward the safety of the Tower of London, telling the rebels and Wat Tyler that if they wanted to continue these negotiations, they could come to Westminster the following Monday after a weekend of celebrations. And how do you suppose this army of angry, revved-up peasants responded to essentially being fobbed off by their king? Not well. Not well at all. As Dan Jones puts it, quote, livid at the snub during what should have been their moment of greatest triumph, the leadership turned their inflamed party round and set off back to Blackheath Hill. Restraint was ebbing away, leaving behind it a raw plain of retributive fury. London Bridge stood a couple of hours' march away. Against the will of the true commons, there could be no escape for traitors to the realm. End quote. And so, Wat Tyler and his men marched on London. They swarmed the London Bridge, they flooded into the city, heading right for the homes of those on their list. And though John of Gaunt was away in Scotland, he had a bunch of properties in the city, and the rebels sacked them, the most famous of which was the beautiful Savoy Palace, home to the Dukes of Lancaster. Outside of sacking and burning down the residences of the rich, they also went to the jails to free whoever was locked away, something they had been doing since the beginning in Essex. Now, not only would this increase their numbers, but it was also a statement against the authorities and the rule of law. The rebels continued their march down the streets of London, finding and executing anyone they considered to be their enemy. Many, once found, were pulled out into the streets and beheaded. And in that first night alone, the night of Corpus Christi, 18 men were beheaded and their homes set on fire. And apparently the fires burned so hot that they blazed for a week straight. Those who had the chance escaped to the Tower of London, a fortress that still stands to this day, though it's just a tourist attraction now. I was last there in 2019, I think. I distinctly remember the toilets on the top level of the central tower that just empty to the outside and the grounds below. In the medieval period, at least. They're part of the museum. They're not for public use anymore. But anyway, the king and many of his men were hiding out in the Tower of London, purportedly the safest place to be in the event of an attack. Richard tried a feeble attempt at promising to pardon the men and address their grievances if only they disbanded and went home. But they were all bloodthirstiness and momentum by that point, so the suggestion just angered them even more. So now, Richard was faced with a conundrum. Give over his men and advisors and capitulate to the rebels, or find a harsher way to stop them. The mob was moving ever closer to the tower, so he had to make up his mind quickly. The first thing he decided to do, though, was meet the rebels at Mile End, early in the morning on Friday, June 14th. The idea was to bring them away from the tower, which they had surrounded, so those trapped inside, who would certainly have been murdered, could escape. So Richard rode through London to try to draw the rebels away. Did it work? No. No, it did not. And according to a later source written by one of the sheriffs who was there, he wrote it like 18 months after, one man came close enough to just about grab the reins of Richard's horse, which is far too close for someone in an angry mob to get to the bloody teenage King of England. Like, what a horrible idea. And as King Richard trotted down the busy streets, the leaders, Ball, Tyler, and some other leaders, they weren't even there. They weren't even there. They were the organizers, the ones who could calm down the angry mob if needed. So the King of England is now out there in the rabble, virtually unprotected, just hoping they didn't decide to kill him as well. I mean, say what you want, but it's a ballsy move. Now, when Richard asked what they wanted, they gave, actually, really reasonable requests. Not the list of heads they asked for on the river a couple days beforehand. The crowd asked for freedom from servitude, a tax cap, a limit on how much their landlords could charge rent on land, and that no man be forced to work like they had been since the Statute of Laborers was passed by Richard's grandfather, Edward III. And considering they had spent the past 2 days looting, setting fire to half of London, and chopping heads off, this was a pretty calm moment, actually. And it goes to show that they had no intention of committing regicide, of killing the king. They just wanted equality, and were fed up with those standing in the way of it. But Richard wasn't there primarily to negotiate a truce. He was a diversion to get London's most wanted out of the tower unscathed. Did it work? No. Because Richard, in all of his infinite teenage wisdom, said something really daring and, frankly, really stupid. He encouraged the rebels to roam free across England and catch the traitors and bring them back to be tried before court. I guess his idea was like, yes, go, leave London, find the traitors, bring them back to me to get them to go away, right? But, I mean, the rebels knew where the traitors were. They were locked away in the tower. So they went straight for it. Dan Jones believes that had Richard not said that part out loud, maybe the crowd would have dispersed, happy to have been heard by their king. But by essentially greenlighting the wholesale hunting and slaughtering of those they deemed to be traitors, Richard doomed his own men. And it wasn't long before the rebels took the tower. They flooded through the rooms, laughing and dancing and jumping and clearly enjoying their victory. They grabbed everyone that they deemed a traitor. Sudbury was found in the chapel reciting prayers, and they pulled him outside to Tower Hill along with the others, readying for an execution. It was Friday morning, June 14th, and Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was at the mercy of a very inexperienced executioner, and it took 8 blows to the back of the neck to finish the job. 8 blows. Which means many of them likely missed and just kind of severed his spine or smashed his head in several places. Now, Sudbury's head, like many others before him at the mercy of the peasant rebels, was mounted on a pole and paraded around town, a warning to others and a show of victory. Now, among those so-called traitors in the tower, one important person escaped, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt and cousin of the king. He most definitely would have been killed alongside Sudbury, but a soldier concealed him and helped him escape in all of the chaos. Henry Bolingbroke later became King Henry IV, who ruled England from 1399 to 1413. It's a long story for another day, but Henry was exiled and then came back and deposed Richard in 1399 and took the throne from him. And it's thought that Richard was either murdered or died of starvation in captivity. Like I said, a story for another day maybe. Henry and Richard. It's a real weird one. June 14th, 1381 marks the only time in history that anyone has ever successfully breached the Tower of London. So, among other things, the Peasants' Rebellion carries that distinction. They conquered towns and cities, stormed the Tower of London. It was quite the feat. Things in London were bad. As Dan Jones writes, quote, "In short, Richard may as well have handed a blank charter to the rebels, upon which they could write his approval for any act they chose. Murders became executions, assaults became punishments, treachery became justice. With the spectacular failure, both in concept and in execution, of their strategy to diffuse the revolt, Richard and his court were now so paralyzed by fear that it was all they could do just to watch the bloody heads of his ministers bob past on lances." End quote. And this is just what was going down in London. Elsewhere, English peasants and laborers who had heard the news of what happened were rebelling as well, and the country was in chaos. What would happen to the rule of law, to the government? The people in this moment had power over the nobility who had ruled and controlled them for generations. But we know that the monarchy survives. Richard would rule until he was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt's son, in 1399, right? So how did the Peasants' Rebellion end with the country still intact? Rumors were running rampant. There was one that Wat Tyler was going to set London completely on fire, another that the king was going to be taken hostage, another that John Ball would become England's one and only bishop, another that the church was going to be abolished, and in addition to these rumors, Wat Tyler was no longer willing to negotiate to stop his rebellion. So Richard did what he had to, based on the advice of whatever council members were still alive. He drew as many rebels as he could outside the city walls to Smithfield with the promise of another meeting and a compromise. But this time, he was prepared to do more if he had to. At Smithfield, the king came face to face with the rebel leader Wat Tyler. But when Tyler approached to give him his list of demands, it was significantly less, let's say, realistic. He spouted ideas about abolishing the lords altogether, destroying the church hierarchy and just having one bishop for all of England, presumably John Ball, and essentially the very forward-thinking idea that everyone should be at the same social level and afforded the same amount of land and status. It's pretty advanced thinking for 1381. The king was generally dismissive of these really out-there requests, but was still trying to appease Wat Tyler to get him to calmly disperse. It wasn't the response that Tyler was looking for. The momentum of the last few days had him thinking that he could be the one to finally abolish serfdom and lordship completely. The two purportedly just stared at each other, waiting for the other to make a move. Wat Tyler broke first. He drank some water to cool his thirst, spat it out in front of the king, then turned his back on Richard to mount his horse, which are all very disrespectful actions to do in front of the King of England. Jones explains it well, quote, "The power he had wielded for the last week had totally consumed him, and the way he acted towards Richard suggests that he truly believed that before long the whole realm would bend to his will as King of the Commons. Tiring of the negotiations and having shown his contempt for his opponents with his deliberate show of bad manners, he made as if to leave." End quote. Someone in Richard's retinue yelled out that Wat Tyler was nothing but a thief, and Tyler lost his cool. So he grabbed his dagger and threatened death on whoever spoke, and this was the moment that the king's men were waiting for. William Walworth, the mayor of London, rode out to Wat Tyler and placed him under arrest for his behavior in front of the king. And as Walworth went to go grab Tyler, Tyler thrust his dagger at the mayor, but it didn't do any damage. It just bounced off his chest plate. So Walworth retaliated and stabbed Wat Tyler, leader of the Peasants' Rebellion, through the neck. He then withdrew the dagger and stabbed him again in the head as more of the king's men closed in, their swords drawn, running towards the leader of the rebellion, and running him through. And this is where King Richard finally displayed the bravery that a medieval king needs to have to rule effectively. He rode past the dying Wat Tyler, who had fallen off his horse in a really bloody spectacle, and he went right up to the rebels across the field, and he commanded them, as their king, to leave Smithfield and follow him further north to Clerkenwell Fields, a more open space. And spellbound and probably very confused about what just happened to their leader, they followed their king. The king's councillors rode back to London, going ward to ward, amassing an army of loyal London citizens to help break the rebels and save their city. But Mayor Walworth returned to find Wat Tyler, to end him once and for all, make sure he was dead, right? Because the rebels aren't going to stop if their leader is still alive. Walworth didn't find him in the field where he left him. He was apparently taken to a nearby hospital. So this man drags the almost dead, bleeding Wat Tyler back out to the field, props him up, and then beheads him in front of whoever was still around to watch. Very befitting, I suppose, considering how many beheaded men Wat Tyler was ultimately responsible for. Mayor Walworth joins the king at Clerkenwell Fields, clutching the head of Wat Tyler, and this was enough to turn the tides. The rebels fell to their knees, asking for forgiveness, and they just wanted to go home. And Richard agreed, and the London siege was over. The king knighted the mayor of London right then and there, on the spot, so now he is Sir William Walworth, and the rebels retreated the way they came. But it wasn't completely over, as other leaders were still alive, including John Ball, who was now on the run. And I'm simplifying things a lot here because the story wouldn't end if I didn't, but John Ball was eventually captured in Coventry. As he tried to escape, he was trying to run north to York, and he was sent to St. Albans, where the king was staying because there was a minor plague outbreak in the city, and it was there that John Ball was held accountable for 20 years of inciting the people, then inciting the Peasants' Rebellion, and for encouraging the common folk to storm the tower and kill the men inside, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. For his crimes against the crown and English rule of law, he was hanged, beheaded, disemboweled, and quartered. And like with other infamous English enemies, and I'm thinking specifically about the Scottish William Wallace here, who was executed at the beginning of the 14th century, John Ball's now quartered body was carted off to 4 different parts of the country as a warning not to cross the crown. Now, of course, there would be more work to be done, a city to be restored, and smaller rebellions and unrest to quell throughout the country, and Richard saw to it, establishing himself as a proper Plantagenet king. He was brutal, authorizing beheadings for those who continued to rebel against him, and many more rebels died in the aftermath. John of Gaunt survived the whole ordeal, as, again, he was away in Scotland for the worst of it. The Peasants' Rebellion, often relegated to a sentence or not at all taught in our American public schools, was an incredible moment in English history where the common people, angered at the unstable political climate and worsening, unfair economic policies of the nobility, rose up, stormed the capital city, partially burned it to the ground, and almost destroyed the monarchy. Had they wanted to kill the king, they could have. They were physically so close to him that it could have happened. But in the end, their leader, swept up by the madness and momentum of bloodthirstiness and power, lost sight of the goal. To protest the unfairness of Edward III's disastrous Statute of Laborers and fight for more rights for the common folk of England, all a response to the damage done by the Black Death, and to protest the damaging poll taxes. And because he lost sight of this, he was killed and the rebellion was over. But at least when Parliament met later that fall, they realized that the poll tax was maybe not a great idea. It was the final straw that led to the rebellion after all, so they sought funding a different way, and not through increased taxes on the commoners of England. And the next time the English did try to do this was in the late 15th century under the Tudor king Henry VII, who tried to raise money for a war against the Scots. And it was met once again with a rebellion, the 1497 Cornish Rebellion. But as Dan Jones summarizes, Wat Tyler, John Ball, and the Peasants' Rebellion, besides being an excellent story that has survived and been retold in literature for generations, shows that the English common people were a political entity. They cared about bad leadership. They cared about foreign policy and raising monies for wars abroad and the state of their country. They fought against purported traitors to save their king and country, and in the process, fight against the laws that strangled them. It was more than just angry peasants expressing their rage. They represent a political consciousness and a changing population. Gone were the days of passive peasantry living in a feudal world ruled by nobility, and as a result of the Peasants' Rebellion, England was forever changed. And not long after, King Richard II would end up deposed, replaced by the Lancaster branch of the Plantagenet family, who would later go on to lose to the Tudors during the War of the Roses at the Battle of Bosworth Hill. And like the Black Death, the 1381 Peasants' Rebellion showcased a changing 14th century. And soon, England would transition into the early modern period and the beginning of their imperial hegemony. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelli Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the 1381 English Peasants' Rebellion. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things, subscribe to AFOUT on YouTube, and check out Nedrick, the musician who created the song you're hearing right now. Links for all of those things are in the description. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.